Welcome, Raymond Ibrahim. Welcome to this late autumn event at the Free Press Society. Tonight we are happy and honored to welcome author, historian and pundit Raymond Ibrahim. Raymond Ibrahim is the author of, among other books, Sword and Scimitar, Crucified Again, and Defenders of the West. And he has written countless important articles about Islam's war against the West and everybody else for that matter. Many of which the Free Press Society has shamelessly published over the years. One of Ibrahim's central points is that Islam's war against the West cannot be regarded as single, isolated wars based on specific disagreement, but should be regarded as an ongoing religious war of conquest with the ultimate goal of subjugating the entire world to Islam. The Muslim persecution of Christians should always be interpreted in this perspective. The Danish government is currently introducing new laws to curb freedom of free speech and restrict criticism of Islam in order to appease pressure from the same Islamic countries whose own Christian minorities have been ruthlessly persecuted for years. Before I give the floor to Raymond Ibrahim, just a few remarks of the course of the evening. Raymond Ibrahim will speak for approximately 45 minutes, after which there will be a break, and here you can have a cup of coffee or a glass of wine, and then we'll meet here again for the second half, where you will have the opportunity to ask Raymond Ibrahim questions and make comments. We end the meeting no later than 9:30. So, without further ado, I'll give the floor to Raymond Ibrahim. Welcome.
Thank you all very much. I hope you don't mind if I sit down so I can access my computer. Okay. First, I'm very happy to be here, and thank you to everyone who helped organize this event, Aya and Eben, who helped make it happen. I'm very happy to be here. Very important topic, as we can see. So my understanding is the main pressing topic we're talking about today, that is I'm talking about and you're asking me about, is the persecution of Christians throughout the world. What it is, how it's happening, why it's happening, etc., etc. And this, by the way, is a very near and dear to my own heart topic. Why? Because my family are persecuted Christians. So I think I should start with a little bit of my own background. I was born and raised in the United States. My parents are from Egypt. They're what's called Coptic Christians, which are the indigenous Christian inhabitants of Egypt, who predate the Muslims by many centuries, actually. And so growing up, I was already aware, even though I was living here in the United States, of what was happening there, and I understood it and I heard it. And I ended up gravitating and studying in college kind of these topics. I majored in history, and I dealt with the nexus of the conflict between Islam and the Western world, Europe, Christendom, precisely. So even in 2000 or 1999, when I was writing my master's thesis, it was about the first pivotal battle between Muslims and Christians, the Byzantine Empire, as we call it, in the year 636. And that's when 9/11 happened, a year later. And I ended up continuing my studies, going to Georgetown and other universities, and working at the Library of Congress. And this was really my job: Islam, radical Islam, etc., etc. And my early books dealt with Al-Qaeda and translations from Arabic. But then probably around 2006 and 2007, I started gravitating to this topic because, like I said, it's important to me personally. It's part of my background and heritage. So I've really been writing and researching about this topic of Islam, Muslim persecution of Christians since probably 2006. And my first book dedicated to it came out in 2013. It's called Crucified Again: Exposing Islam's New War on Christians. And even before that, and I'll talk a little more about it because it's applicable, but I've been writing a report called Muslim Persecution of Christians, and I produce it every month. And what I do is I just go as far, I find all the reports on, not mainstream media because they don't talk about it, but alternative media, foreign language media of Muslims persecuting Christians on any given month. And I put it together and I collate it since 2011. So If you do the math, it's been 12 years times 12. It's about 144 reports, each one of them being about 4,000 words. And the funny thing is, when I first envisioned this idea, I thought to myself, this is kind of ambitious. You want to write a monthly report about Christians being persecuted? What if a month comes and there's nothing, or just some minor story? Sadly, that's never been a problem. And I'm at a point now where I have so much information that I don't use all of it. I only try to get the most, the most relevant aspect. So it's a non-stop, habitual, systematic issue, which we can talk about. And like I said, for my own family, extended family, have to various degrees understood this. And another reason I'm involved in this is because I think the Western public in general is completely ignorant about it. After all, if I tell someone today I'm a Copt, the first question I get is, which police precinct do you work for? Okay, so you can imagine. So what I'd like to do is start off with a little statistics, just to give you an idea of how bad the situation is, because you're not going to hear it from the mainstream media, obviously. And then we'll talk about why that is, because that, of course, itself is very important and telling to why this is happening. So there's a lot of organizations who collate information and data about this particular topic of Christian persecution, and they're pretty, impeccable. They're trusted even by non-Christian organizations. And I'm using one of the most conservative numbers. So there's other people who will give you bigger numbers. But this group, which is called Open Doors, it's an international organization, and they have, every year they publish something called the World Watch List. They've been doing this for decades. And what it is they rank the top 50 nations in the world where Christians are being persecuted by rank. So the first of the 50 is the worst, and the last of the 50 is not so bad, but it's still terrible compared to what you would expect according to modern standard decency towards human rights. So according to this report, the most recent one, which came out in 2023, but it deals with the year 2022, 5,621 Christians around the world were killed for their faith. Now that's different. That some people may think that's not a big number, but what that means is they were actually killed because they were Christians. Because someone targeted a Christian church and bombed it while they were there, or because it was a woman and she's Christian and they figured she's easy prey and they raped her and killed her. A lot of that happens too. So that's that number. The number is actually significantly bigger if you talk about just Christians being killed and slaughtered. But then the element arises, which is, well, we don't know if the Muslim who killed the Christian was doing it just because of religion. Maybe it was something personal. Okay. But the 4,000 or the 5,621, those were bona fide documented cases of just Christians being murdered because of their religion. That's a big number. Can you imagine what the world would say if 5,621 Muslims were killed in Europe because of their religion? It would be a story, but here it's not, of course. And there's other statistics. According to that same report, 360 million Christians, now that's a bigger number, are not being killed, but they are suffering, quote, high levels of discrimination and violence in the Islamic world. Again, this is not something, this isn't, someone in Denmark feeling that someone's giving him a dirty look because he's Muslim. Discrimination, persecution, this is very real. This is like you don't get a job, you get pushed out of a neighborhood, whatever, just really, and very open and violent stuff that obviously impacts the life of the Christian. And then a little more kind of a demographic dispersion. So on average, in the world, according to this most recent, and as I said, conservative report, 1 in 7 Christians in the whole world, which is 14%, are persecuted severely. Okay, in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, that number grows to 1 in 5. So 20% of the Christians in Africa are being severely persecuted. In Asia, it's 2 in 5, okay, which is 40% of all Christians are being persecuted there. All right, and we can get into the and I will to a certain extent the more kind of details of what this means, what persecution means, and it comes down, if you boil it down, according to this most recent, again, very credible report, 15.4, or as you can say, between 15 and 16 Christians are murdered for their faith every day in this world. That sounds like a problem. You'd think that's something that we could talk about on the news. But of course, that's not even something we're going to talk about at all, and I'll get into that also why. And what's also interesting is that I've been looking at this for years, like I mentioned. So I'm giving you the most recent tallies from 2023. But if you look at it as I have since 2015 till now, that number just continuously keeps growing. Okay, so in the most recent year, I told you 360 million Christians were being experiencing high levels of persecution and discrimination. In 2019, it was only 245 million. Okay, from 360. So that's based on the math that I did at the time. That's a jump of 70% in just a handful of years. So where are we going with this? And new countries keep being added to the list. So it's now, last I read, 50 is not enough. We have to add more. You have random countries like Nicaragua, which is actually now seen as a persecutor of Christians, which may sound counterintuitive because Nicaragua you would think was a Catholic nation. But and we'll get into all the myriad factors that exacerbate the situation for Christians. Now, again, I'm still talking about this particular report. In the top 11 nations, okay, and in these nations, the worst 11 nations, these are the nations where if you're seen as a Christian, you're free game. You might get killed, murdered, arrested, imprisoned, raped, beat, whatever. Okay, these are 11 nations. And I'll read them to you. So the first, interestingly, is North Korea. And then second is Somalia, third Yemen, fourth Eritrea, fifth Libya, sixth Nigeria, seventh Pakistan, eight Iran, 9 Afghanistan, 10 Sudan, and 11 India. To be a Christian in those countries is like a death warrant. Now, what's interesting to me, if you're paying attention to these countries, is I just mentioned 11. 9 of them are Muslim nations. Okay, so I think that right there starts indicating who's the lion's share of the persecutors. North Korea obviously is not of these numbers. Of the 11 I mentioned, North Korea is not, and India is not. So the first one, North Korea is not, and India, 11th, is not. The rest are all Islamic nations. Now, if you extend this to the actual 50 nations, it comes out to 40 of the 50 nations are Muslim nations. Okay, so clearly, in as much as this is an important and pressing topic, it is global, obviously, but there's definitely a particular actor involved in the persecution of Christians around the world, which I would call Islam, because most of this, 80% of it, is happening in Islamic countries. All right, and then when you think of countries like, so a lot of people will complain and tell me, well, North Korea is worse, and it is. North Korea, if you're found as a Christian, you're done. Okay, that's why it's number one worst country. But the good news about that is there's a light under the tunnel, because North Korea is just, it's a cultic kind of, dictatorship, and this charismatic guy, if you want to call him charismatic, whatever. I mean, some people call him that, but it's a cult. And, he's responsible for it. It's a top-down persecution. But Korea, because there's nothing ingrained to it, it's just him, it's a temporal thing. Once he's gone, North Korea could just be like South Korea, which is actually a very vibrant Christian nation. So it's not an existential aspect when you look at certain other countries like North Korea. Okay, the problem is in Islam, and we'll talk about that, it is existential. And this is why Arab countries, African countries, Indonesian, East Asian, Pakistan, Iran, these countries don't have a lot in common, culturally, racially, socioeconomically, but they have Islam in common. And so it's very telling that you will see the same patterns of persecution arise in all of those countries, and even though they're so different. But what makes it worse, and going back to the North Korean example, there is no light under the tunnel for these countries, because the reason all of them are so different and at the same time doing the same thing is because it comes down to one word: Islam. They are Islamic countries, and the persecution, dislike, hostility for Christians and others is just inimical to the religion itself. Okay, and I don't want to spend too much time trying to explain that. I think this particular audience understands it. But briefly, Islam's doctrines are so hostile to the non-Muslims. They're very divisive. Okay, and as I've explained before, the genius, if you will, of Muhammad is that he took his tribalistic society of 7th century Arabia and he re-articulated it it's still tribal, but through deistic terms. So now it's not one Arab tribe against another. It's the Muslim tribe, the Ummah, against the world, because they're all the bad tribe. And so the same thing that the Arabs would do to other tribes, which is, in that mentality, in that culture, 7th century Arabia, if you're not part of my tribe, you are free game. I can kill you, rape you, enslave you, plunder you. That's it. That's the society. So I think Islam took that, but it changed it. It's not this tribe or that. It's the Muslims against the kafirs, the infidels, which is everyone else. So, and there's so many verses I can get into, and people don't know this. I mean, they think the concept of jihad is in the Quran, and it is, but it's really worse than that. To me, the more telling Quranic verses are the ones that don't preach jihad, but preach hatred. Okay, so in the Quran, it literally says to Muslims, you must hate non-Muslims. You must have enmity in your heart for them. All right, and it has a whole categories of how to do that. And so, for example, in Islam, it's okay for a Muslim to marry what's called a woman of the book, meaning a Christian or a Jew. And often in politically correct circles, this is presented as a form of tolerance. But that same Muslim is according to Islamic teaching, and I've seen so many writings and videos by Muslims saying this, he has to hate her because she's an infidel. And according to these divisive doctrines that I mentioned, he must hate her and he must show her he hates her in the hopes that she converts. But he can enjoy her sexually and treat her as his wife otherwise, okay, because that's also convenient. So that's, and also the Quran talks about, it praises those Muslims who killed their fathers, their mothers, their siblings, their children, their wives, because they were not Muslims during the time of Muhammad. Okay? So it's so divisive that, if you're not a Muslim, you are the enemy to be treated with accordingly. And again, there's a whole bunch of categories on how to do that, including here in the West, because it's not a stupid doctrine, and there's a lot of caveats that help enable it, including deception. Okay? That was just a brief kind of little doctrinal interlude to explain why it is that Christians are being attacked. The Quran calls Christians infidels, okay, because they believe in the Trinity, and it says that the Christians who believe in the Trinity are infidels. Infidel is an English word that I use, and it's not necessarily a good translation of the word kafir. The word kafir basically in Islamic jurisprudence means your blood is free game. Okay. If you're a Jew or a Christian or any non-Muslim, you can be killed at will, at sight, done, okay, subjugated, whatever, and the authorities are with you. And a lot of this, of course, I'm giving you is historical, but as you can see and can imagine, it still impacts modern-day Muslims because they read these texts, even though you don't, because they're intentionally hidden from you, okay? So that's I just wanted to give you a little quick doctrinal, because someone may be thinking, why this hatred for Christianity? All right. And I gave you all these statistics. So let's take a real quick case study about the deaths and the murders and all that. So Nigeria, in my opinion, as someone who's been following what's happening, Nigeria today is the absolute worst war zone for Christians. Nigeria is about half Muslim, half Christian. Most of the Muslims are concentrated in the north, and most of the Christians are in the south. But it is, and according to numerous human rights organizations, neutral ones, it's a genocide what's happening right now. There's a genocide that's been going on before Ukraine, okay? And it's been going on for years. And the numbers, I'm looking at some numbers right here. So just between 2009 and 2021, it's been much worse since 2021 in the last 2 years, but just between those 12 or so years, 70,000 Christians were butchered because of their religion by Muslims in Nigeria. And 20,000 churches were burned, destroyed, and turned into mosques. I mean, just imagine for a moment if this was the opposite. If this was Christians doing this to Muslims, do you think you might have heard of it? You think it would be in the news? All right. So that's one example. Now, the other thing for me that I think also really solidifies the idea that this is an Islamic issue is the patterns. So I told you since 2009, I've been really closely following and documenting the persecution of Christians under Muslim countries. And what amazes me is certain patterns always emerge. And it doesn't matter the country. Again, we're talking about, remember, when you talk about the Muslim world, you're talking about different races and economics and societies and cultures. You're talking about Persia, Iran, Turkey, and then you're talking about the Arab world. You're talking about Indonesia, Malaysia. You're talking about sub-Saharan Africa again. But what you find interesting is the same patterns emerge in the persecution of all these different societies. And why is that? Because if you read about it and you look into it, it actually goes back to Islamic law, Sharia. Okay, so one main example is churches. There's an attack on churches all throughout the Islamic world. Sometimes it's from the authorities. All right, Saudi Arabia. If you're in Saudi Arabia, our good friends and allies, you cannot have a church in there. And there's a fatwa out there that says if there's a church or even some Christians, workers, Filipinos sit in the house and try to celebrate Christmas, they get arrested and tortured. Okay, that's our good friends and allies in Saudi Arabia. But then there's the terrorists, and they'll take it a step further. They'll go bomb it and blow it up. And we've seen that countless times, not just with ISIS, the Islamic State, but so many other groups that their names morph and change, but what they are is Islamic terrorists, okay? And that's happened a lot in Egypt, in Syria, in Nigeria, all throughout Iraq, constantly. Russia, I mean, even countries you wouldn't think about. Also, there's this, what I call like a trifectal attack on Christian freedom. And this goes back to Islam. If you're a Christian and if you're a Muslim and you want to become a Christian, you're an apostate. You're done. This goes on constantly in these reports that I look at. You're attacked, you're killed, you're imprisoned, you're beat up, you're ostracized from your family. If you're a woman, they take your children away. All right. A blasphemer. So a Christian blasphemer is basically not, here in Denmark, you think a Christian blasphemer is a guy who burns a Quran. But in the Muslim world, a Christian is a blasphemer who says something like, Christ is the Son of God, or Christ was resurrected. Why? Because you are contradicting the Quran, and therefore you're calling Muhammad a liar. So you're a blasphemer, and you get attacked, and you get killed. And this happens so many times, especially in countries like Pakistan, where they have these really draconian laws. Same thing for evangelists. If you're a Christian preacher, okay, whether you're indigenous or Western or whatever, and you're in the Islamic world, you will get attacked, you go to prison, you get killed, okay, because you're the one who's creating the apostates. So there's a lot of tremendous pressure. Now, these three things, apostates, blasphemers, and evangelists, this is all written out in Islamic Sharia law. The Caliph Omar, who created this pact with the first Christian so-called Dhimmi community in Jerusalem, after Jerusalem was conquered in around 637, made them agree to all these stipulations. We're not going to build churches. We're not going to renovate churches. We're not going to show our crosses. We're not going to say anything against Muhammad. We're not going to preach. So this is actually part of the religion. And then other patterns, of course, come in, which is one of the more popular ones that you probably don't hear about, is the sexual abuse, rape, and forced conversion of Christian women. That is, again, very endemic to the Islamic world, wherever there are Christian minorities. And other minorities as well. But as I'll explain in a bit, there's a reason there's more Christians in these regions than elsewhere. So when I learned all this, when I started that, I mentioned that I've been running a report since 2011, that I told you I thought, well, maybe a month will come, there'll nothing be there. No, there was always something there. But all these patterns emerged. And to me, it was very telling that every single one of these patterns had an Islamic imperative traced back to it. It was there in their books, and they knew it. And if you can read Arabic and watch their videos like I can do, when these attacks happen, that's how they justify it. They quote the Quran. They quote the Hadith, Muhammad's words and sayings. So it's always there, the hostility towards Christianity. Maybe a couple of words about history. So how did all this happen? Until today, with my joke about Coptic being a police officer, so many people, I think, in the West are completely oblivious to the historical origin of the Middle East and the Islamic world. Okay, when you talk about the Muslim world, and if I talk about this topic, and I say Christians are being persecuted, etc., you know what I'm often told? Well, I get it, I feel bad for them, but why are they going there in the first place? Why are they going to the Muslim world? Well, it's because they were there centuries before the Muslims came. So here's a little bit of the hidden history. In the 7th century, when Islam, splashed onto the world scene, if you talked about the Christian world, and you definitely had a Christian world, this is 7 centuries after Christ, and you looked at the map, most of it, the heart of it, the more sophisticated, intellectual, and richer part was the East, or what we would call North Africa, from Morocco to Egypt, and all of the Middle East, Syria, Greater Syria, which encompassed what we would call today Israel, Lebanon, and all that. It was Greater Syria and Iraq, and of course, what we call Turkey, Asia Minor. That was Christianity. And then you had an outpost in Rome, okay, which was also, of course, significant. And you had 5 sees. One of them was Rome, the other 4 were in the east, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Constantinople. In just 1 or 2 centuries, the first century, Islamic conquest completely swallowed up that whole area, the older, richer, original Christian region, which is North Africa. I mean, think of people like, Augustine of Hippo. I mean, he's a North African. And if you think of the Nicene Creed and all the Arian controversy, all these guys were actually Coptic Egyptians. Athanasius was Egyptian. Even the Arian heretic was an Egyptian. So you had a lot of heavy Christian influence from that area that people don't remember. They think Christianity is something that just happened in Europe with Rome, etc., later on Protestant Reformation. But actually, this is why Constantine went from Rome. He actually moved the capital to the east, to New Constantinople, or New Rome, named after him, Constantinople. So this kind of history, I think, is very important to understand what actually happened. Muslims conquered it piece by piece. And I discuss it in one of my books. It's dedicated to show you how century after century, battle after battle, you had a very hardcore Christian region slowly turned into Islam. And then the Christian minorities, the remnants, had to do as best as they could. They became what's called dhimmis, okay, which is like according to Islamic law, like a second class or a third class citizen who has to pay tribute and then live according to all these strictures. Don't build churches, don't renovate churches, hide your crosses, don't talk about religion, don't offend the Muslim. It even has laws like if you're in basically like the Rosa Parks American thing, if a Muslim wants your seat, give him your seat. So that's how it was for centuries. And now, and then even Europe, okay, so after all of North Africa and the Middle East was conquered, in 711, this is not even a century after Muhammad died, you had Islam in Spain conquering it. Islam conquered Spain in the year 711. And then 20 years later, 732, it's in the heart of Europe at the Battle of Tours. Charles Martel, you're familiar with that. So before that, you saw like dominoes, all these ancient Christian regions being conquered and being subjugated, and all of the stuff that we're talking about now that seems to be some sort of modern aberration started then. So that's why for me, when I talk about Christian persecution today, it's a continuity. This isn't new. This is just the continuation of a very old story that has been shielded from you, because you know Islam is a religion of peace and tolerance. So obviously whatever is happening now is not representative of Islam. It's a minority extremist kind of thing. So the story goes. And we have to talk about the Crusades if you want to talk about the misrepresentations of how people understand things. So Islam from the year 636 to, I mentioned 1032, I mentioned 732, the Battle of Tours, but then all the way, there's so many more battles I discuss, and by 1070, okay, Islam now has conquered Asia Minor. This is one of the oldest Christian regions. Most of St. Paul's letters are to Asia Minor, because that's how Christian it was. Now it's Turkey, we call it, okay? But at that point, this is right before the Crusades, they were almost near Constantinople, and the Eastern Emperor called for aid, and the Christians saw what was happening to the Armenians and the Greek Christians in Anatolia, and the sources are horrific. Tens and thousands of Christians being massacred, butchered, enslaved. churches burning in one city, one Armenian city, Ani, 1,000 churches were burned intentionally. It was, so, when you hear about ISIS, the Islamic State, it was that on steroids. But it was actually not a bunch of terrorists. It was the caliphate. It was a sultanate. It was the representatives of Islam who were talking this way and who were acting this way. And that's the origins of the First Crusade, which I find very interesting. Because the First Crusaders learned what was happening to the Christians of the East, as well as to the church and the Holy Land, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was, of course, important to them. And that's why they went there. It was actually a heroic stance against aggression. And it completely accorded with what Christian teaching says is just war theory. Okay, we're liberating, we're defending. It's not aggression. This is originally Christian territory before it became Muslim. So we're going there to wage crusade. And it was, of course, for centuries seen as one of the most noble, altruistic Christian things. Today, of course, it's the most demonic thing. And Christians are still being pounded on the head about the Crusades. Why? Because the whole story has been completely subverted. And I've read so many historians, and I can name them, and I know them. You might know them. You might not know these names, but they're very big in America. People like John Esposito, Karen Armstrong, who purport to be historians. They will present Islam spreading peacefully for the first few centuries, and everything was fine. And then in the year 1095, these evil Catholics decided to go and just create war and havoc. So it's presented in a vacuum, as usual. And this is something that happens today in politics when we talk about modern day instances and events. They're presented in a vacuum. You're not told that Muslims were massacring, killing, torturing, raping, burning churches. One caliph before the Crusades burned 30,000 churches in Syria and Egypt alone. Okay? I mean, so the problem with so many of the lies today is not that they are not telling you the truth. It's they're withholding the background. So they tell you the truth. Yeah, these crusaders went and fought and killed. Sounds kind of bad. But they're not telling you what the Muslims were doing to provoke all this anger. Righteous anger, I would argue. So to me, this is another... That's why I've very much gravitated towards the historical aspect, not just because there's such an evident continuity between what Muslims have been doing to Christians, but because it really makes sense of why Islam is the way it is today, because it hasn't changed, okay? But when they put it in your head that Islam, if you go to any college or watch a documentary, Islam is peace, and the only time you have barbarians, it's in the Middle Ages when you get the Crusaders, and then they ruin it, and they alienate Muslims who are hitherto tolerant and open-minded. That's all lies. That's just completely fabricated, and it's meant to demonize, honestly, the Christians as opposed to the Muslims. And to stick one more point about the Crusades, everyone here has heard of the Crusades, right? Whether you like them or dislike them, you've heard of them. But the fact is, if you stand back from a macro historical point of view and you look at all the wars and conflicts and antagonism between Christians and Muslims, the Crusades are a drop in the bucket, very insignificant. You don't hear about the Muslim attacks that swallowed up vast portions, as I told you, of North Africa and the Middle East, or how they swallowed up Asia Minor, or how they conquered Constantinople. Spain was conquered, and it took them 800 years of warfare. Okay, people don't know that Muslims went as far as Iceland in the 16th century to get slaves. Okay, and Denmark actually. And England, they had I think it's called Lundy, a little island off the coast of England, where they raided the English coast for slaves. And then you look in the east, same thing with the Ottomans. I remember reading in their documents and chronicles, every year they'd come back with 100,000 Hungarians or Slavs in general, which is where we get the word Slav or slaves. Then there's the Russians, and that's completely been sidestepped because Russians are not hip anymore. But they're part of this long story too. You probably heard of the Mongol yoke or the Tatar yoke, where the Russians were actually conquered by the Mongols. What you don't hear is they actually were converts to Islam, the Tatars as they're known, and they also brought in the whole panoply of Islamic law, discrimination, hostility, and the Russians were living under that for centuries. So if you actually look in these Russian chronicles, they're not fighting against Mongols, they're fighting against Muslims. Okay, so this was a really multi-tentacled jihad, if you will, on every corner of America. Even the United States of America, not America, of the world, even the United States of America, few people know this, its first war as a nation. So, of course, it had the Revolutionary War with Britain. After it gained independence, maybe 10 years later, it actually was drawn into another first war as a nation with Muslims, the so-called Barbary pirates of North Africa, because it was their job to enslave Christian vessels that they would find and take the Christians and plunder them, etc., etc. And none other than Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to Congress. It's dated, I have it in one of my books, like 1796. And he talks about how he met the Muslim ambassador from Barbary and said, "Why are you doing this? And we want to make peace. Don't attack our vessels." And then he quotes what the Barbary ambassador said. And the quote is like reading ISIS talking to us. The Quran says you're an infidel, you're our enemy. It's our duty based on the Quran, on our prophet, to attack you, plunder you, kill you, make subjects of you and slaves, and destroy your churches, etc., etc. So you can only imagine what Mr. Thomas Jefferson thought, because he's the paragon of the Enlightenment, after he heard that kind of logic. Okay, but so the point is to show you this has been going on for so long that I always find it mind-boggling to have someone come and tell me, "Oh no, Islam means peace, and the radical thing, that's something new. That just happened." No, it didn't. And so, to move back to the modern Christian era, to me, it's just a continuity. There's no difference, because the same stuff that happened then, they were destroying churches in Christian regions. As I told you, one caliph, 30,000 churches. That's according to Muslim sources. Okay, this isn't an exaggeration. That's what they say. And this was seen as a work of piety. So it's little wonder that the remnants of Christians, whether they're Copts in Egypt or Assyrians in Iraq, in Syria, or Armenians, if you know what's happening with Azerbaijan and Armenia, there's another genocide going on, which is entirely based, again, on religion, though no media will tell you that. It's just a territorial dispute. Okay? But if you dig deep down inside, you're going to find it's the same exact dynamic. The first thing these Azerbaijanis do is they go and destroy churches, break the crosses, and turn it into a mosque. Okay? They go to Christian cemeteries and destroy and pulverize the crosses because they don't want to see it. And they want to claim it's our land, and we're never Christians here in the first place. So it's sad on the one hand that this is a very long history which has been suppressed, and therefore we don't understand current events. So when you see Christians being persecuted, one of the reasons, or one of the excuses a talking head today will say, "Oh, it's because of this. It's because of grievances, or it's a territorial dispute." No, dig deep down inside. It's always the old ancient religious hostility for Christians. Now, it's actually getting much worse. Hitherto, what I've said, I'm sure I'm talking about Islam. You're thinking this is an Islam problem, and it is. I told you 80% of the 50 nations and so forth are Muslim. But it's actually, now that I'm still following it, it's getting much worse, and it's spreading into other nations. So now India is actually the 9th or 10th worst nation in the world, where it's almost the same sort of persecution that Christians experience in the Muslim world, in the worst Muslim world. And I saw really graphic videos recently and the things that are happening, and the same logic. You may say, well, they're not Muslims, so what is it? And I think what's happening now, and it's not just India, I mentioned Nicaragua, I mentioned South American countries, which are traditionally Catholic, and we're going to talk a little bit about Europe, but I think it's just ultimately a hostility towards Christianity. And whatever excuse is needed is going to be the excuse that's implemented. For Muslims, it's the Sharia thing. Amongst Indians, it's a nationalism thing. You can't be a true Indian if you're a Christian. So then they persecute, ostracize you, and it's going on now in all these countries. So I really think it's bad enough the way it was with just Muslims, but it's becoming more and more of a global attack on Christians, including here in the West. Even if it's considered minor, people here, or at least in America, they talk about the war on Christmas. Okay, so if you're a Christian, you can't say Merry Christmas. You have to say Happy Holidays. You can't you can't really emphasize the Christian nature of Christmas. Okay, I'm sure it's the same here in Europe. So as you can see, it's not just the Muslims, but there's other factors and forces involved and they're really all working in concert for the same end. And it's sad to see so many Christians are completely oblivious to this. So one of the questions is, well, what about the media and the journalists? Because they're objective, and they should at least report the truth with what's going on. After all, what I've said sounds dramatic. I mean, surely this is a news story. It should be on some report. So how to explain it? Well, there's a lot of ways to explain it. The first, I actually think, or one of the more obvious ones, it's unfashionable. I think Western peoples, European peoples, especially Christian, they're very happy to show their altruistic love for others and help, but not those Christians, because that almost looks tribal. We're picking the same guys that we are. It's much more fashionable to support Buddhists or, Indians and or Muslims, the Rohingya in, Burma and what's happening. But to help Christians, it's almost like you're helping my kind of guy, and I want to show you I'm actually open-minded. I'm not helping. I'm not tribal. I'm helping other people of their religion. So I think there's that stigma that, ironically, because Christians are what so many people in the West are, they're the least helped because you don't want to help them. You want to help something a little more that shows you as more open-minded, more tolerant, as opposed to being tribalistic, I suppose, in this sense. Then there's the hypocrisy, and I'll just show you. I'll give you one example of how bad the hypocrisy gets. So March 15th has been dubbed, if you don't know this, as Combat Islamophobia Day, international, by the UN and other governing bodies. So on every March 15th, we all must acknowledge, recognize, and seek to combat Islamophobia. And why was that date picked? Because on March 15th, I forget, 3-4 years ago, in New Zealand, I suppose some Australian guy walked into a mosque, and killed 51 Muslims. I'm sure you all heard of it. How could you not? Okay. Yeah, Christchurch in New Zealand. 51 Muslims were killed. So that was enough for the UN to declare International Day to Combat Islamophobia on the date of that massacre. Now, it just so happens, because I track this type of thing, that I did a little research, and I came that in that same time frame, roughly, there were about 100 attacks by Muslims on Christian churches. Not in one country, but the Middle East, North Africa, Pakistan, Indonesia, Turkey, Iran, everywhere. Okay? And of course, the main culprits, Egypt, Iraq, in sub-Saharan Africa. There were about, I documented and collated something like 20 attacks of Muslims attacking churches, and they killed over 1,000 Christians. All right? Just in those attacks. But there's no Combat International Christian Phobia Day for some reason. Okay? But one attack where you had 50 Muslims get killed was enough for the whole world to stand up and create a whole new day. All right? But when you got 1,000 people killed, and in this case, the parallels are even worse, because you can say that the Australian guy who did the Christchurch, New Zealand thing is an aberration. How often does that happen? It's not like a daily thing where some Western guy goes and kills Muslims. But they made it into a pattern. But where there is a pattern, where you have Muslims in numerous countries under the same logic, quoting the same Quranic verses, bombing churches and killing Christians, that is dismissed as, well, it's just a product of terrorism. It's just a product of whatever. It's not anything against Christians. They won't even name the word Christian. I don't know if you remember this, but one of the worst Muslim attacks on Christians back when Obama was president, he would not even say Christians were killed. He said Easter worshippers were attacked and killed. Okay? So to just kind of, again, sideline who's being killed and who's the killer. Okay? So this is obviously a big issue. And, the latest one that the excuses that they come up with to rationalize why Muslims kill Christians, which they won't even say that much, is grievances. Okay, Muslims have grievances, and I'm sure you're familiar with this. Muslims are angry and therefore they lash out and kill, which is your fault because you made them angry. Okay, so that's the standard explanation. But then you have the most recent one I've seen, and show you how ludicrous they are, but also how clever they are, because they're trying to kill two birds with one stone. That is to, push two of their agendas. The new reason that in Nigeria, 5,000 or 4,000 Christians get killed every year, and I quoted to you the number 60,000 in about 10 or 12 years, is because of, wait for it, climate change. Okay, so it has nothing to do with the religion. It just so happens that the Muslims are killing the Christians, but it's because climate change is pushing them, and they have nowhere to graze their livestock. So they go and dress in black and scream Allah Akbar and cut Christian heads off. Yeah. It's climate change. So there's definitely a very big agenda, and there's so many other examples. Another one that just popped in my head is one of the most sensationalist Islamic terror attacks on Christians was, if you recall, I think it was in 2015 when the Islamic State videotaped themselves butchering 21 Coptic Christians in Libya. Remember the orange jumpsuits? And I actually, because it's my job, I have to watch these videos, and they're really off-putting, but I have to watch the details as they chop their heads off, which is very real. And that actually got some coverage in the Western media. Of course, it was presented as an aberration. These guys are not Muslims, they're terrorists. And they didn't even attack. These guys aren't even Christians, they were Egyptians, okay? But that story, someone wrote a very interesting article, and they documented it, got 8 times less media coverage than the killing of a gorilla in America. So a gorilla was killed. You may remember this because it was a big story. So they had to put down a gorilla because some child fell in the zoo or whatever. That received 8 times more coverage than 21 Christians literally having their head chopped off because they would not recant Christ. Okay? And again, I ask you, imagine if this was Christians doing that to Muslims. Do you think that would have gotten some coverage? Do you think you would have heard about it? Okay. So clearly there is a major agenda. And maybe it's good to kind of wrap it off here, bring it home, make it personal, because I understand you have very large Muslim populations. And I'm not, when I talk about this topic, I don't talk about Muslims because I don't know what's in the mind and the heart of a person, okay? I mean, someone can tell me he's a Christian, but he's not. Someone can be that kind of Christian. So when I hear someone's a Muslim, I don't know. But what I do know is that Islam is fundamentally, inherently tribal and divisive and hostile. That's the religion. Now, maybe there's Muslims who don't believe in that and they don't incorporate it in their lives, and maybe they do assimilate. I have no problem with that. But I know there's a lot of the other guys, okay, who do think this way. And it's definitely happening here in Europe. So maybe you're familiar with this website called the Observatory of Christian Phobia. It's actually a European website. Anyway, I follow it, and every single day there's like 2 or 3 stories of churches in Europe being attacked, vandalized, crosses being broken, okay, cemeteries being desecrated, crosses being broken, etc., etc. But nobody knows who could be doing this. But to me, because I know what happens in the Middle East and the Muslim world, this is common. In the Muslim world, it's very common for Muslims to desecrate Christian cemeteries, break crosses, attack and burn churches. And in France, it's so bad. I did some research and I wrote an article a few years ago. But apparently in France, every day, 2 churches are attacked in very graphic ways, like feces smeared, Mary statue or Christ statue decapitated, churches broken. And finally, it got so bad at one point that some American big mainstream media wrote a report about it. And I read it. And, they got the facts straight that there's attacks on churches, et cetera, et cetera. But when it came to who, I went up and down. I didn't see the word Muslim. I didn't see the word migrant. I didn't see the word Islamist. And in the end, it said, the main culprits appear to be feminists who are angry at the patriarchy. Okay? So there's a lot of work. There's a lot of effort to conceal what's happening here, which is just a reflection, a small reflection, for now, of what happens there. Okay? Where Muslims are in strength, Christianity is completely obliterated. abused churches, etc. Now I look, and it's ironically, when I look at Europe, the countries that are most attacked in this sense, ironically, have a large Muslim population. They're France, Germany, Sweden, Denmark too. I mean, you're not as bad, obviously, as these big countries that have big Muslim populations. But you see it too. And it's, again, the same pattern. To me, patterns are very revealing of who's behind this and what's going on. These are all the patterns I see where Muslims are attacking Christians in where they're the majority, the Middle East, Muslims. So it's not surprising to wonder or to think who's doing it, especially when the worst countries have the largest Muslim populations. Okay, so it's definitely spilling into here. It's coming into here more so into some countries than others, clearly. But it's definitely, and there's so much naivety because the history I just told you, the doctrines I just told you, and the statistics I just told you are all anathema. These are not things that anyone's going to be talking about in your primetime news because they have a narrative. And what I'm talking about is a wrench in that narrative. And they're never going to do that. So I think that's the current state of affairs, and I will end it there and take a break and have questions. Thank you.